We'll just be starting in a moment as we're allowing people in from the electronic waiting room. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Rocco Rossi, President and CEO of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, and today is the 100th day anniversary since the WHO announced the global pandemic. So, as a special anniversary gift to all of you, we've brought together an absolutely phenomenal panel on a super important discussion, because if there is one thing that the crisis has underscored, it is the incredible digital divide. Those companies, those organizations, those countries who've been able to react and leverage digital assets have been doing far better than those without. And of course, 5G is the next stage in that evolution. And so we've partnered today with the Consulate General of the United States here in Toronto, our very good friends. And the other really special treat is I'm not going to be moderating. You're going to get a super smart person from our policy department, Claudia DeSanti, who is fresh off of releasing our report just the other day on In Data We Trust. So lots of insight into the digital transformation and into the evolution of the new economy. Of course, our webinar series would not be possible without the assistance of our phenomenal partner sponsors from Bruce Power, Canada Life, Hydro One, Waste Connections, and the Chamber's Plan. With no further ado, over to my colleague, Claudia DeSanti.
Thank you so much, Rocco. It's such a pleasure to be moderating today's webinar on a topic that has gotten quite a bit of attention recently, and for good reason. The Ontario Chamber of Commerce has been advocating for regional expansion of broadband and cellular infrastructure for many, many years, recognizing that the ability to connect to reliable high-speed internet is not a luxury, but a basic requirement in today's economy. We hear about this issue from our members almost every day. It's a key driver of their productivity and their competitiveness. And with COVID-19, as Rocco mentioned, the digital transformation has only accelerated. And that's one of the reasons we launched our data report just a couple days ago. The report discusses the opportunities and challenges of Ontario's data-driven economy, and it has chapters focused on privacy, cybersecurity, data sharing, and artificial intelligence. If you're interested in reading the report, you can find it on our website. But today we're diving into the issue of 5G specifically, and we're joined by subject matter experts, 4 of them. So Melissa E. Hathaway is president of Hathaway Global Strategies, LLC. Kevin Ramdas is professor of wireless telecommunications programs at Humber College. John B. Simcoe is lead of the National Telecom and Media Practice at PwC. And Natalia Vlajic is associate professor in the Electrical Engineering and Computer Science Department at York University. Welcome to our speakers, and thank you so much for joining us. To kick things off, we're going to hear a presentation from Melissa Hathaway. Her biography is remarkable and quite extensive, but I'll give you an abridged version here. Melissa is president of Hathaway Global Strategies. She's a leading globally recognized expert in cybersecurity who consults governments, global organizations, and Fortune 500 companies on cybersecurity, enterprise risk management, and technology assessments. She served in 2 presidential administrations where she spearheaded the cyberspace policy review for President Barack Obama and led the comprehensive national cybersecurity initiative for President George W. Bush. Thank you, Melissa, and over to you.
Thank you, Claudia, and thank you to the Chamber and to the U.S. Consulate for enabling me to support this initiative. And I am really delighted to be here with you this afternoon. So I want to just really talk about the digital economy and how it's a comprehensive going to depend on 5G. So currently the global economy is little over $100 trillion. And the estimates is it's about 15% of the global economy currently is based from the digital economy. And that digital economy really requires us to have a strong telecommunications backbone and is going to require more bandwidth and more spectrum in order to enable us to connect more devices to the internet and to modernize our infrastructures and our enterprises. In Canada, the digital economy is growing faster than most of the other economic activities, and year over year, it's been almost 42%. That includes e-commerce, digitally delivered products, hardware and software, and of course, the telecommunications backbone that is going to power these new digital devices into our homes, our businesses, and our critical infrastructures. As it is the 100th day of the World Health Organization's declaration of the pandemic, that was the 11th of March, the world really collided into these digital platforms, and we started to begin to understand that telecommunications are essential. We have seen an increase of more than 1,200% of all of us using these collaborative platforms and voice and video, like we're using Zoom today or Microsoft Teams or WebEx or whatever is the key platform that is enabling us to stay connected and to drive our businesses. So the technology path is important to understand what is 5G. Well, from 1G to 2G was moving us from voice to text and from analog to digital. When we moved to 3G, that allowed our phones and our connected devices to move into the internet. And 4G allowed us to move to video. Now 5G is going to require us to have low latency, high bandwidth expectations. It's going to start to enable augmented reality, robotics, drones, etc. Moving from smart devices through a radio access technology to the access of the network in the core and enabling cloud-based technologies. We're going to 5G goal is 5 gigabits per second is its target for high speed, low downlink and uplink. And this is important because right now we have usually high speed downlink to our devices from our telecommunications carriers, but we have slower uplink from our houses and from our devices up into the internet and to the telecommunications network. Estonia, United States, South Korea, China, Sweden are some of the key countries that have adopted the 5G technology, and they are accelerating, but none of us are going to really have a true 5G technology in our cities until probably 2023 or further out. So why is 5G different? 5G is different because you can no longer distinguish between the core where data is processed and the edge where we connect to our users. We now have a seamless, entangled integration of the edge and the core where data is processed in both places and the command lines are coming from the core of key technology. And so it's very difficult to put security measures in place to minimize risk. To give you a better understanding of what is the connectivity, 4G, we only have 50 to 75,000 devices that are in a 1 kilometer radius here of the Toronto Eaton Centre. And as we move to 5G, it's going to present us the opportunity to connect 1 million devices. So 10 times the capacity of the 4G networks, which is essential for us as we move to the Internet of Things and the industrial Internet of Things. 5G technology, as I said, is high speed, low latency, and it is essential for the future of the Internet of Things and the industrial Internet of Things as we connect more and more devices to the networks every day. And in fact, we're connecting right now about 127 new devices every second to the Internet. You cannot buy an electronic device today without it connecting to the Internet. And that presents us with a number of opportunities. The connectivity infrastructure that 5G will enable will allow us to have new products and services that will affect all sectors. e-health that we're experiencing right now through COVID. We're seeing a very significant increase in telemedicine and televisits with our doctors. You already have some smart energy grids deployed and using the technology for the industrial Internet of Things through our power. We're seeing factories of the future that could actually enable robots and controlled over and through the internet. And then finally, we're seeing more and more connectivity through the mobility and potentially the driverless cars. Specifically in Canada, I think you'll see first uptake will be for smart agriculture. Currently, it's 6.5% or a little bit larger of your GDP. You're the fifth largest exporter of agri-food. And as you start to connect the IP devices in these fields in order to understand if they need more water or chemicals, or on your cattle or hogs in order to understand from farm to table where they've grazed, etc., you'll start to see unique aspects of the internet be used in order to drive growth of this sector. You'll also see enhanced logistics, building on the opportunities that you already have through logistics infrastructure across the country, using autonomous vehicles and everything, these devices across the community. Not only will you see the GPS navigation that we already have in our cars and real-time weather updates, but you'll also see other vehicles on the roads and you'll see internet-based applications embedded in our cars. Advanced manufacturing will build on Ontario's largest manufacturing base and the 350 automation and robotics related companies that you already have in the region. Advanced manufacturing will enable robots. It will becoming and dependent on artificial intelligence and enable the industrial Internet of Things in ways that we had not seen in the past, as long as the telecommunications infrastructure can support it. Finally, we're going to see more smart cities. The Smart City Challenge that you just released in 2019, you had multiple cities that their awards. You saw the Guelph and Montreal are working on food delivery and food access. And you'll start to see this applying the digital technology to empower these connected communities to bring and make our lives better and more efficient and less costly, we hope. The digital economy and connecting to this internet infrastructure is going to generate about $13 trillion of economic opportunity by 2035. And that's significant. And so there's no wonder that our countries and our companies are racing to capture this digital opportunity. But we currently have very few choices of the telecommunications equipment providers that are going to power this core infrastructure. We have Ericsson from Sweden, we have Nokia from Finland, we have Samsung from South Korea, and then we have Huawei and ZTE. There are a number of things that are happening right now to enable these national champions to be the technology providers of our next generation future of the digital economy. But there are challenges facing us that we don't know how long this will last. The risk mitigations and measures that we're implementing for 5G, they vary. Right now, we believe that we've mitigated the risks from 4G because it's not an entangled infrastructure. The core is separate currently from the edge. But as we move to 5G, there will no longer be that distinction. The core will be processing data, the edge will be processing data, and it'll be seamless and taking advantage of the power processing at the edge with our devices, as well as the cloud infrastructure and the like. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what's going on from a risk mitigation procedures as we start to embed these technologies into the core of our businesses and the core of our society. The United Kingdom took upon itself a telecommunications review of its the core equipment providers through the National Cybersecurity Center and the intelligence service of GCHQ. They had made a determination of, as they started to embed 5G technology, that they needed to start to limit high-risk vendors from their core infrastructure. In fact, limiting any high-risk vendor to just 35% of the core. And there was a recent decision at the end of May that perhaps the United Kingdom should review its decision regarding Huawei of whether or not it should phase out Huawei from its core over the next few years. And this is something that's under review right now. At the same time, the United Kingdom launched an initiative with the top 10 leading democracies, the G7 with Canada, and then South Korea, India, and Australia. How can we as countries work together, not only to mitigate the risks of the current aspect of moving to 5G, but can we work together to drive innovation to get to the 6G technology or whatever the next generation technology will be, working together on the standards, the technology development, as well as the risk mitigation procedures. The EU has also started to push forward with the 5G toolbox, and the EU undertook a series of assessments in 2018 and 2019, which led to the release of the 5G toolbox in January of 2020. It moves forward with strategic measures on regulatory powers and how do you evaluate third-party suppliers and the technology in the overall enterprise and the critical infrastructures, as well as the network security and the 5G specific measures that we will have to adopt within the standards process. Member states all still have the opportunity to look at this individually within their own country of how do they strengthen the requirements of their mobile providers and ensure that each operator is looking for and ensuring vendor diversity so that there's not any one vendor that has the monopoly in the core of its infrastructure. Australia also did an evaluation and concluded that the risk was too high to have Huawei in its core of its infrastructure. After doing a fair amount of assessment and analysis, they understood that with when a government could compel a network provider to insert code that if that was, it could go actually undetected by any of our key technologies. Australia was actually one of the principal advocates to the United States of taking the United States to why the United States has a very similar position to Australia, that the risk is too high for this equipment. So what should we worry about? Well, the British have told us that through their evaluation of the code, that the code is buggy. And in fact, the Huawei research and development and the leadership of Huawei would agree that the code is buggy, that it has a number of vulnerabilities, that their engineers are not equipped and don't understand how to do secure development lifecycle. And Huawei has invested more than $2 billion over the next 4 years to reskill their engineers, to introduce them how to do this secure development lifecycle and to try to create a better product. But we're still 4 years away before we'll see the actual outcomes of their investments and the reskilling. Huawei is also a composite of really very good technologies that we should not forget were illegally acquired and repackaged into their products from Northern Telecom and Cisco and Motorola and others. Intellectual property theft is core to the advancement of the key industries of China, of which Huawei and their telecommunications providers are that. We've also worried about the law. The law in China is very clear that there are multiple laws on the books. The counterintelligence law says that any relevant organization must truthfully provide information and cannot refuse the state for cooperation. Its intelligence law says very similar, that you must cooperate in national intelligence work, and you're obliged to provide facilities and assistance where necessary. We're also seeing predatory pricing coming from China. We're seeing interest-free loans, and we're seeing their products coming into the marketplace at 40% less than what their competitors are offering, which is a very attractive option when many of us are looking for economic opportunities and a lower price point to get to a similar functionality in our infrastructures. But is the economic benefit worth the national security and critical infrastructure risk? If you should choose a path that says that you're going to go against Huawei or not embedded in your 5G, you should be prepared for retaliatory diplomacy or wolf diplomacy, and that could potentially hold your economy at risk. We've seen this already done with Germany really holding Siemens and some of the automobile manufacturers at risk. We've seen it in Australia through other trade, and we've seen it here in Canada with actual agri-trade, et cetera, being held at risk. But could you afford to have your critical infrastructure of your power and your water and your digital economy to be held at risk if you were at odds with China by not choosing Huawei? Every 10 years we see an innovation, and it was we're about 5 years or 3 years into the 5G innovation. And it's not too early to start focusing our technology corridors and our innovation centers on 6G, the next generation standards, and leapfrogging to that technology as fast as possible. And I think that we should accelerate that journey through Silicon Valley to Waterloo, across our countries, that we should look at these Democracy 10 and actually see how we can accelerate and begin that journey today. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you for articulating the opportunities and risks so clearly for us. We're now going to hear some brief remarks from our remaining guests before we have our interactive discussion. First up is Kevin Ramdas. Kevin is a professor in the program and the program head of the Wireless Telecommunications Graduate Certificate Program at Humber College Institute of Technology and Advanced Learning for the last 15 years. He has been a leading expert in the field of telecommunications for the last 20 years and has been on the forefront in the evolution of connectivity from 2G through to 5G. Please go ahead, Kevin.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, Melissa. Thanks for that great overview of 5G and the issues and challenges that we're going to have in the future. Thank you, Chamber of Commerce and Humber College, for giving me this opportunity. Over the next 5 minutes, I'm going to talk a little bit about the business trends that are happening in the telecom and IT industries, the patterns that I notice, followed by some ideas about how businesses can take advantage of those trends and what we need to do as a province to support it. What I'm going to argue here in the next 5 minutes is that over the next several years, we're going to get to a point where installing 5G connectivity will be almost plug and play, almost like installing Wi-Fi. But it's going to be like a super enhanced Wi-Fi. On both sides of this 5G connectivity, there's going to be a lot of opportunity for us to use those services to, one, enhance the existing 5G, to enhance existing businesses, and two, for new businesses to build brand new services that sit on a 5G platform. In effect, we're going to create a full new 5G ecosystem, and 5G, that connectivity and the services will be just an enabler. All right, so what is 5G? Pretty much whatever you want is what you're going to get. The wireless connectivity, we can break it up as macro coverage or hotspot-like coverage. And when we look at the macro coverage, those are still going to be in the domain of our telecom service providers. However, when we look at what 5G does, it's a catch-all for all of these competing requirements that are pretty close to impossible to technically integrate into one solitary system. So when we look at the 5G standards and architectures, they're designed to be flexible in order to have separate types of implementations depending on the use case. All right, Roland, next slide, please. The three components of our system. One, you've got your radio access network, which gives you that last mile connectivity, and you've got this connection to the internet. But in between is the magic. That's where we have our core, a 5G core, and integrated very tightly could be some services that we can provide. And that's where all the magic happens. That's where all of the economic opportunity is in. So let's talk a little bit about what's happened in the last couple months with respect to the 5G core. In March, Microsoft recently acquired a company called Affirmed Networks. And Affirmed Networks, their main product is a 5G virtualized core. And another purchase that Microsoft made was of Metaswitch. Metaswitch is a company that provides virtualized services that can attach to 5G and 4G cores. So when you look at what Microsoft is doing, they're starting to build this ecosystem in and around that 5G virtualized 5G core and those services. Microsoft is not the only company that's doing this. There's a company in Japan, Rakuten, which is a really big internet services company, and they're at the verge of also rolling out and building out their 5G core as well. So what are the implications of having a virtualized core and virtualized services? Well, one, because it's all virtualized and it'll be containerized, they'll be able to spin up their core and build an entirely customized network in seconds. You say build, you click the button, and then the virtualized core can be up. So you can turn it up and turn it down on demand. And secondly, you can easily layer cloud native services on top of that core within seconds. So when we look at offering 5G as a service, this is no longer going to be solely in the domain of the telecom service providers, nor will it be our version of connecting to the internet anymore. There's going to be a lot more competition in that 5G space because the services will be much easier to build. The interface for building those services can be as simple as building graphical drag and drop services. So for example, if you're trying to build a product, you can build a product where you're gonna have customer onboarding, authentication, service delivery, payment, and you can build all of those services via a drag and drop interface. And all of a sudden you've got from product ideation all the way out to service delivery, all in one user interface that you can be doing graphically. So next slide. Thanks, Roland. So what do we need to have happen here? One of the biggest parts of this for Ontario is that we need to have unrestricted fiber connectivity. We need to have, as businesses, we need to advocate in this investment because it's going to be equivalent to, let's say, what the railroads and the power grid and water supplies to us. And the more connectivity, the more people and businesses that we can reach within the province, the more opportunity we're going to have to develop on top of it and to innovate on top of that. And the second layer of what we need to do is support knowledge development. We need to do it as a business community. We need to invest in our leaders to have vision to understand what's coming in the future. And also we need to empower all of our people, our HR side, in order to have them prepared to take advantage of the opportunities that are going to lay ahead. So pretty much that's my take on it. If you have any questions, you can send me an email at my Humber address or connect to me via LinkedIn. Thanks.
Thank you, Kevin. And now I'll introduce John Simcoe. John is the Telecom and Media Leader for PwC Canada and is the Technology, Media, Telecom, and Consumer Markets Practice Lead in the GTA. He has worked extensively with private and public companies on the Canadian, US, and Hong Kong stock exchanges. Take it away, John.
Oh, thanks a lot, Claudia, and really appreciate the opportunity today to speak with everyone. Would love to have actually done it in person, despite what we're talking about today. I would like to focus some of my comments around the competitiveness aspects of the 5G build out, and in particular, what are some of the things that can help accelerate that, and what are some of the things that that may impede that. Because I believe that the countries that take the lead in deploying 5G will have a significant competitive advantage over other countries. And so, you know, if a company has access to a large domestic market with advanced 5G services, I believe they will be first to develop new sophisticated use cases, applications, and 5G related services. So I'd like to see our country be one of those countries at the forefront. But I have some concerns about the pace of Canada's rollout of 5G. I really think, you know, acceleration of that rollout could help with our global competitiveness. Conversely, delays could certainly have the opposite effect. So a couple of things on that, notably, and I think in her comments, Melissa touched on this, that countries moving first in the 5G network deployment have done so with some regulatory cooperation. For example, the US and South Korea first launched 5G between 18 and 19 through pilots and then some commercial rollout, and China launched trials in 2019. The US, South Korea, and China's regulators all focused on early distribution of 5G spectrum, which allowed network operators to deploy 5G early. And in addition, these countries' governments have encouraged 5G deployment. For example, the US 5G Fast Plan focuses on streamlining 5G regulation. So in terms of key enablers of this build out, and conversely, you know, potential obstacles are, I believe, the considerable investment that's involved, which in this case in Canada is in the tens of billions, and also supportive regulatory environment. So I'd like to look at each of those. Let's start with the investment involved. At the moment, if you look at recent past 2016 to 18, the Canadian telecom operators make a higher infrastructure investment than international peers, with capital investment as a percentage of revenue being about 40% higher than many of the international peer telecom operators. This investment, though, needs to be supported by a market structure and a regulatory environment that's conducive to innovation and rapid adoption of technology. So when you look at capital expenditure as a percentage of revenue running about 5% percentage points higher than telcos in comparison countries, you know, which includes spectrum costs being higher as well, as a result of higher factors of production in Canada too. So some of those key factors, which are also relevant for the 5G rollout, one of them is related to how our population is dispersed, and another is around economies of scale that are afforded in a market size the size of Canada. Spectrum costs certainly are a major factor, and then other factors which another factor that can negatively affect the costs is the weather. Not any surprise to anyone here. A couple of things that are competitive advantages for us, relatively speaking, on the factors of the cost for the build out: labor costs, corporate taxes, and electricity costs are comparatively better in Canada than many of our competitors. So there are some positives there. The 5G networks, it was mentioned, it's a key enabler of many of the use cases anticipated. We talk about at PwC Industry 4.0, and we believe that the 5G networks are expected to cost Canadian telcos anywhere from 23% to 71% more than what 4G cost. The majority of the benefit, though, for 5G is expected to actually accrue to the broader Canadian economy in aggregate, rather than the telecom sector. You've got about 11% of that direct value generated from 5G that's anticipated to really attribute to the telecom sector. So there is a little bit of a dichotomy there. And another study by the Canadian Wireless Telecommunications Association in 2018, it was estimated that by 2026, Canadians will experience benefits of 5G through an annualized 40 billion of additional GDP, about 250,000 sustained jobs from direct and indirect 5G impacts, and 154,000 short-term jobs related to the actual network build, which I'm talking about at the moment. So who pays for this? Won't be any news to anybody here that what I'll call consumers pay for it, whether that's consumers like you and I or businesses, through either tax dollars or poor network quality or retail prices. There are some different models that have been looked at and experimented with in doing network builds previously. It's worth taking a second to consider those. Direct government participation in Australia in designing and building and operating telecommunications networks was one, NBN Australia, and that was then opened up to a monopoly opened up to wholesale service providers. Heavy regulatory intervention through service-based competition, resulting in insufficient incentives and cash flows to keep pace with technological generation, is generally what was done in many parts of Europe. And frankly, at the other end of the spectrum, letting consumers pay for network investment through retail prices, the US has followed this approach in both its wireless and wireline markets, with facilities-based competition and no direct government intervention. Now, research that PwC has done with Ericsson shows that consumers are willing to pay 20 to 30% more for the benefits of 5G. However, I do think most carriers believe that the greatest opportunity for 5G monetization, for some of the reasons that both Kevin and Melissa spoke about, lies with enterprises rather than consumers. So if we look at the experience of moving from 3G to 4G, I think there's some important lessons there. And I'd like to focus for a second on Europe and what happened there. They had arguably, they were leaders in the 2G to 3G transition globally, but I think had a tougher time with the 4G build out. And there's really three main reasons that caused that kind of delay and impeded progress. There's evidence that procedural and licensing regulatory related delays, freeing up spectrum being one of them, in EU member states caused delays in releasing spectrum for mobile network operators, MNOs, to use. Secondly, it's widely understood that the European MNOs overspent in the 2G to 3G transition, which impacted their ability to properly invest in 4G. So as a result, the business case for 4G just became a longer one to justify the investment. And the third, resulting or related to weak balance sheets among MNO European market participants. So that, coupled with a high fragmentation in the market and a declining average revenue per user, ARPU, meant that the MNOs were ill positioned to financially invest in 4G. What did that mean? It meant that by 2013, 3 in 4 European citizens were left without 4G access, while at the same time, coverage in the US had already reached 90%. So think in terms of Uber, WhatsApp, YouTube, Waze, the list goes on, of key new services that were developed and initiatives developed out of the 4G technology. All of those that I mentioned, by the way, were American. So when I think about the impact of this development, I think it's critical that we be market leaders, or at the forefront at least. The regulatory environment with respect to spectrum costs, which I've referred to already, they're among the highest in the world in Canada. But I do think a delayed release of the spectrum bands here is a concern. There's some other concerns that I would have related to some research that we've done about the impact of mandating mobile virtual network operators, MVNOs, access to the networks. The result of regulations mandating MVNOs, as a result of that, returns would be split basically amongst all the players, those that build the networks and those that don't. Doesn't sound like a very good deal if you're an MNO. And this is likely to discourage some of the investment by the incumbents, and that won't help us get that infrastructure in place and be more competitive. So I think, right now, especially when Canadian regulators seem to be pursuing lower prices for end consumers, whether this is achieved through a mandated wholesale MVNO access or otherwise, our research would suggest that ARPU declines that could result in advance at the early stages of that network rollout for 5G could have significant implications for the successful adoption of the network. So if MVNO network access is mandated, industry-wide levels of capital expenditure are estimated to be reduced as a result of network operators' response to those impacts on the ARPU and market share. In short, cuts to capital budgets mean 5G deployment could be deprioritized, leading to deferral or elimination of certain 5G investments for some Canadian communities. And this goes to the rural and urban divide as well, because we estimate that effective 5G coverage, which is the share of the population receiving 5G coverage with sufficient quality to realize on those economic benefits that we've been talking about in the use cases, would be in place by 2030, could be reduced by from 95% coverage to that's in a no regulation scenario, to about 75% with that kind of regulation in place that I'm talking about. And in addition to the mobile or the rural and urban divide, as a result of that, realization of important use cases like autonomous vehicles, remote healthcare, et cetera, would be impacted, and that would result in Canada also foregoing many of those expected socioeconomic benefits in the next decade. So as a result, we would have a cumulative loss in GDP of about $57 billion that we've estimated in one of the research pieces that we did. The industry use cases for 4.0 are spread across major economic sectors for the Canadian economy, including production, manufacturing, and freight. And as I mentioned before, Industry 4.0 refers to end-to-end digitization of the physical assets, creating a step change in that productivity and innovation that we could expect. And that's mainly because of the phenomena that Melissa spoke about, where we've literally got an opportunity for millions of connected devices within a square kilometer as compared to in the tens of thousands now. So concluding, I really believe that for Canada to maintain competitiveness with our major trading partners, including the US, but also the ones I mentioned, or China and South Korea, all stakeholders in our ecosystem, telecom operators, the regulator, the government, software and hardware manufacturers, and other industries and consumer support organizations need to cooperate and enact a market environment that enables 5G network investments. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much. Last but not least, we have Natalia Vlasic. Natalia is an associate professor in the Electrical Engineering and Computer Science Department of York University's Lausanne School of Engineering. She also serves as the director of Lausanne's Computer Security Program and is a co-director of the SECRE Graduate Research Lab. Her research expertise is in the fields of computer security, networking, Internet of Things, and machine learning. Thank you, Natalia.
I unfortunately cannot share the screen, so somebody has to stop sharing so I can upload my presentation. Okay, works great. So please just give me 1 second. There we go. So I would like to, and sorry about this, to point out that my talk will have a little bit of different feel to the previous 3. And primarily for the reason that I am a researcher, academic, and network security practitioner. And what's common for all 3 professions is critical thinking. So the title of these 5 minutes that I will take for my insight are 5G, are we ready? And with those 5 minutes, I would like us to start thinking about 5G from the perspective of how safe, secure, and responsibly used it is nowadays. I'm advocating for those 3, and I intimately support, and clearly it's my everyday job to work with technology. But I would not like 5G or any of other wireless technology to be in the place of the plastics related technology that we are seeing today. So I am for very cautious going forward, but in a cautious manner. So as an opening line to why we have to be cautious, I would like to invite everyone listening to today's webinar to think about a product with the following characteristics that I will go through and think whether such a product should be rushed and pushed into the market. So think of a product that is highly likely to be misused by foreign governments. Melissa talked a lot about that, and I think based on what we've seen in the past, there is no question that foreign governments, which are in charge or impact the production of 5G equipment, will put their fingers over that equipment. Number 2, should we rush into the market a product that is certainly to be exploited by cyber criminals and exploited in a very easy and effective manner? The exploitation of IoT devices, which are at the heart of 5G, nowadays is much easier than the exploitation of the standard desktops or laptops, for example. Again, should we push and rush into the market a product that is known as a possible or probable carcinogen? We can debate about these 2 terms, but nevertheless, even according to the World Health Organization, RF or electromagnetic waves are considered as a possible carcinogen. And number 4, the question is, should we blindly rush and push into the market a product that is heavily lobbied for by the wealthiest companies of the world? In fact, that product is their main profit driver. And accordingly, we can expect that many opposing voices to the push of this product will be neutralized very quickly through the lobbies of these companies. The next few slides will be focused on points 2 and 3. Melissa has covered the first one. I will not go into the last ones. It's not the domain of my research, but I am an expert on IoT and telecommunications. So again, I will dwell on points 2 and 3 a little bit. So I would like, again, to remind everyone that at the heart of why we are pushing 5G is, there are different scenarios in question, but at the heart of all of this are IoT devices. Now, there is no question a great promise in IoT devices. They are useful across many industries and can enhance the state of humankind altogether. But for security professionals like myself, IoT devices have proven to date to be a security or to be a nightmare altogether. There are many reasons why IoT devices, as we know them today, are a security nightmare. And when I talk about IoT devices, let me just remind you that we are talking about devices such as sensors, smart locks, smart bulbs, home routers, IP video cameras, smart fridges, and then we can proceed into the medical and industrial domain. Nevertheless, for many of the IoT devices, they deploy scale down, and we know very well vulnerable versions of operating systems. Most of these devices have no firewall or really little firewall protection and no antivirus protection as of today. IoT devices use limited, in some cases, no encryption. Some IoT devices are hard or impossible to patch because of their deployment. Many IoT devices, the way how we envision them, will be used and managed by people who have no knowledge about cybersecurity, and therefore will make those devices inherently more so insecure. And maybe the last point is that many of the IoT devices, as we know them, are manufactured in various foreign countries by a whole slew of different companies that have very little, if no oversight and regulation, and certainly not regulation by Canadian government. Now, these are some, let's say, theoretical points, but the theory on one side, we know from the practical standpoint that IoT devices have really created a chaos in the internet world. We know, for example, that the second biggest distributed DDoS attack ever conducted on the internet was conducted by compromised IoT devices only, and the data rate of that attack was about 1 terabit per second. Now, as the last point on this slide, I'm emphasizing that if you mix these inherently insecure IoT devices with 5G, which envisions the rates per device of up to 20 gigabits per second, then we really will be getting cyber attacks on steroids. In contrast to this attack that I just mentioned from 2016 involving Mirai botnet, where the hackers needed thousands of IoT devices and will need them today, with 5G, it will be sufficient to compromise only hundreds of IoT devices with such high 5G data rates in order to accomplish attacks of this scale, if not larger scale. Here, a few more numbers from the real world. So according to SonicWall, last year alone, they observed 34.3 million attacks on IoT devices, which means hackers have attempted to, or did attempt last year, to hack tens of thousands of IoT devices daily, just because they're low-hanging fruit and very powerful when combined together. And I also would like to emphasize that based on this report and many other ones, we know that IoT devices in some cases are compromised to be used against the third target. But in some cases, especially in cyber physical systems, IoT devices alone can be a target. And through targeting a cyber physical system IoT device, there is a potential for very serious damage to infrastructure and human life. And once again, many things in the IO world are insecure and unregulated, and putting such a technology onto steroids definitely would not be a wise move before the regulation is introduced. On this slide, I will touch upon a topic that I know is very controversial, but nevertheless, again, being an academic, a researcher, and a network security or security practitioner, I feel a need to point to the risks related to 5G spectrum. As you probably know, the frequencies that 5G will or is using are in the range of 5 to 300 gigahertz. I already indicated, and you can see from the slide that on the lower end, 5G is neighboring the frequencies of the Wi-Fi and 4G cellular systems, which we already know, even based on World Health Organization, are possibly carcinogenic. On the upper spectrum of 300 gigahertz, we are talking about already entering the infrared domain. And we know that across the spectrum, either end, if you push a signal with significantly higher than what we assume today is the standard of signal power density, there is an inevitable damage to humans and their health. I would also like to point out the fact that currently, sitting somewhere in the middle of this spectrum at 95 gigahertz, the US Army owns and uses a weapon that is called active denial tool or weapon. and it's used for crowd control. And with this weapon, if you generate signals at the frequency of 95 gigahertz at sufficient power, you will induce the sensation of heat burning on the victim. And if that attack or beaming of these rays is extended over a long period of time, there will be and potentially will be long-term consequences. I would also like to point out that individual devices now are seen kind of regulated. But the IoT devices that are being entered into the 5G market and will be operating on these frequencies are far less regulated than the mobile phones today. They're easily hackable. So in other words, we are making a great vulnerability by introducing this spectrum and giving it for the use of devices that are inherently vulnerable to compromise. So my last slide will just be a cautionary note, and I hope this webinar is attended by some people from the government. Given what I said in the preceding slides, I would like to point to the government people to the fact that by rushing the introduction of 5G, indirectly government is allowing the use of spectrum that we know is possibly harmful from human health. And we are allowing the use of this spectrum by technology that is known to be very vulnerable to compromise. So the combination of these two is a great potential risk. And in case that some of these bad scenarios that I've pointed out to came to realization, then the question is who will be liable for potential damages, and government certainly should consider its role and make sure that at least its part of liability is minimized through various policies and regulations which currently are not in place. And as the really last point of my talk, I would like to also remind the audience of the fact that even though for most people nowadays wireless radiation seems benign, we had the same perception about other products or technologies in the past. I hope many of you still remember the story of baby powder and company that currently is dealing with multi-million lawsuits over baby powder being now a known carcinogenic or talc that is used in it. We also know the stories of BPA, which 10, 15 years ago was assumed to be completely safe, but now we know otherwise. And there are many other similar stories. So what I would like you to take from my talk or my more than 5 minutes is that we have to proceed cautiously and we would not like to repeat some bad lessons from the past.
Thank you, Natalia. Very interesting. So we have some time now for a panel discussion. We've heard our speakers talk about the tremendous upside potential of 5G, but also considerable risks. So there's a lot to unpack there. Thank you to our listeners who submitted some questions. We'll try to go through as many of those as possible. And we're getting a lot of questions about cybersecurity. This is something I think we can start with. Melissa, you spoke about different policy approaches and considerations with regard to risk mitigation. I'm wondering if you can speak to how businesses should be thinking about risk mitigation, and are there any steps they can be taking to build resilience ahead of 5G deployment, and will that look different for different sectors?
It'll absolutely look different for different sectors. I think that it's, you first have to look at what is your overall architecture and how are you going to connect these, what are these, I consider vulnerable devices as the Internet of Things devices were not just designed with security built in, nor were the industrial internet devices. And we've seen a 600% increase year over year of attacks against these devices. So as businesses begin to connect more of these to their architecture, they need to understand really what is the benefit of the connectivity of these particular devices to it, and then how are they building in, or can they demand from the device manufacturers more security built into those devices? And then can they isolate those parts of the network when they are in fact attacked and used for harm? And a really good example of that would be, this week in the United States, we had an outage by T-Mobile, and it was a software update that had catastrophic consequences brought down all of T-Mobile. And then subsequently, any business that was relying on T-Mobile for its telecommunications. So can you imagine in the future that you've got some of your devices are getting their software update and that something goes awry, and then it basically infects your entire enterprise and your entire enterprise is shut down? Companies need to understand what's the value at risk, the price per minute, per hour, per day of being offline when they needed to be online, and could they have put the appropriate isolation mechanisms into their architecture in order to protect the crown jewels and their business operations.
Great. Kevin, I'll get you to weigh in on this as well. What do you think businesses should be doing to prepare?
In terms of cybersecurity?
In terms of 5G deployment.
In terms of 5G deployment, okay. So in terms of 5G deployment, I think that necessarily the things that need ramp up time are physical infrastructure and knowledge development. These things don't happen overnight. There also, as John was mentioning, that there needs to be appropriate regulatory framework that's in there that allows for the, I'm not sure, I don't want to be pro or anti regulation, but it's there needs to be some way that makes it easier to navigate deployment, because a lot of the issues come around, let's say, utility poles or something like that, or where you want to put them up. However, the ownership of them are spread out amongst many jurisdictions, and then different ownership and who's got what is making it very difficult for providers to navigate. And also, I mean, it's not a one-sided thing, because also on the municipality side, they have legitimate concerns about how that real estate's being used. So,
John, did you want to add anything here?
Yeah, just thinking in terms of business risk from a different perspective than the security aspects. And Melissa made a great point, because I can't imagine that kind of outage happening in a 5G scenario where, you know, you're in the middle of a remote surgery or something like that, and the network goes down. So, you know, the consequences with some of the use cases that we're talking about here are truly potentially catastrophic. So, but thinking about business cases, I think it's important to consider what use cases there might be across industries, and also consider what might be applicable both to your business and to your current and anticipated competitors. And I say that because, you know, sometimes with changes in technology out of left field, there could be someone else who, through a development of a new service or offering, is able to disrupt an industry. And so I think with the kind of step change that's involved here, there will likely be some considerable disruption, and I think it's a question of how do you approach that as a business. I think if you're embracing that disruption, looking at it in terms of innovation and productivity in your business, then I think it's healthy, and you can have you know, some great upside potential.
Right. And Natalia, you raised quite a bit of alarm about the risks. And so I'm wondering, when organizations are deciding, weighing the pros and cons, what are the key criteria they should be thinking about, whether that's worth it for them to take on that risk?
Well, let me point out that I did raise concerns, and my concerns are related to the public deployment of 5G. So having one publicly spread network. I, on the other hand, would be a great advocate for private 5G networks, which is not out of question. We are talking about technology, and I do understand that for some companies, having all these qualities of 5G would be very welcome. Which company would benefit in which way? I cannot answer that question. So each company has to assess their own benefits and risk, as Melissa said. But again, I think if anywhere we encourage the use and adoption of 5G, it should be industry. And I would advocate in front of government to allow the companies to tap on this spectrum if needed for their purposes. If it's going to benefit the company and the country as a whole, we should make that process more expedited and allow the companies to tap there. But what I am raising the concern about is the employment over wide areas, densely populated city areas, where even people who are not aware of the risks or have not agreed to take that risk are exposed to 5G rays.
Understood. And so I see a few questions here about regional deployment of 5G, questions about when it will come to rural and northern regions. And I know, John, you talked about this a little in the remark. Can you expand on that a little? Are we likely to see 5G rolled out much more quickly in cities? And how should we be thinking about regional competitiveness if that's the case?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of, I certainly don't have a precise answer on the when certain regions would see rollout, but there's a couple of dynamics at play, and it builds on a little bit of what I touched on in my remarks. But one, in terms of the cost, clearly carriers are going to need to see, really for cash flow reasons as well, they're going to need to see some benefits from from additional cash flows from 5G rollouts. So that would, in my mind, lead to deployment in more urban areas, at least some of the more urban areas first. I don't think, though, that it's a big gap in terms of the time frame here. And I don't think it's as binary as, oh, we're going to build out this city first, and then when we're done, we'll do this area. The nature of these networks, and Kevin touched on it actually in the last question, the nature of these networks are such that there are so many locations that are required. It's not going to be, you build out here and then you build out there, linear like that. So, but I do think from a regulatory perspective, there is some risk, and as I pointed out, I don't want to sound like I'm anti-regulation. Kevin made that reference. It's more a question of caution around what are the regulations and what is that regulatory framework. And what I was getting at with the mobile virtual network operators, the MVNOs, was if you mandated that they must have access to networks that are built by the incumbents, that's quite different than a scenario where you say, hey, they need to, in a free market, obtain access through negotiated wholesale pricing, et cetera. And all I was getting at is through forced regulation like that, you could tip that build out point from what we're anticipating to be about 95% coverage by 2030 to something quite a bit lower, around 75%. And that's when you start to lose some of the use cases that we really see opportunity for. And also it impacts the economy too. So those were really the concerns that I was trying to register. But I don't have anything more precise on the rural versus urban build out.
Right. Thank you. So let's look ahead a little bit towards the next evolution, 6G. And Melissa started about this a little. It sounds very distant, but it's not. Canada's a relatively small player, but often punches above its weight. And I'll start with Melissa here. Where do you see Canada realistically playing a role in this space, and how do we prepare for that now?
Well, I think that there's an awful lot of research that's happening in your university structure, and Waterloo is traditionally known for creating some of the next generation technologies and the like. I think first our government should and our industry should insist on an open radio access network standard to allow for innovation at the edge. Right now, we have proprietary access networks. Each of the equipment providers have a proprietary standard, and we need that to open up so we can have innovation at the edge and we can have a lot more players enter into the market. But we also need to start worried about 6G now. None of us worried about 5G back in 2007 and 8 when we should have been working it. And And so therefore Canada and the United States, we don't have technologies. So if we started to work now on 6G and driving the standards and the technology development, then we would have, in theory, market leaders for 6G when it's ready to roll out by 2030. And if we were really smart, we would actually accelerate it as fast as possible so that we had our own technologies to displace 5G earlier rather than later.
Great. Natalia, John, go ahead.
Oh, okay. No, I'm okay if Natalia wanted to go. I was just gonna just building a bit on what Melissa said. And I think it's quite insightful. Because of our scale, realistically, Canada will not be a priority market for some of the infrastructure leaders who are really located largely in Asia and Europe. So we do need to find another approach to taking a leadership position when it comes to even 6G. And so I think partnership across the ecosystem, which would include our education institutions, which increasingly attract expert international talent, and all levels of government will be critical in identifying new ways for our industries to gain some of that competitive advantage.
Great. So I'll go to Natalia and then Kevin for the last few minutes here. Anything you want to add here as we look forward to 6G, what you'd like to see governments working towards, any kind of studies that they should be taking, and approaches from a regulation perspective? Natalia, I'll start with you. You're on mute.
Yes, very briefly. I think it's really important, again, it's a computer security expert talking. It would be really important that we foster homegrown talent. I think our, in general, over-reliance on the talent from abroad is not a good strategy going forward. So I absolutely support Melissa's idea that we fund local Canadian academia to foster and lead this research, instead of making us overall, from the academic side to the industrial side, over-reliant on the foreign countries.
And Kevin?
Pretty much, I see, if you go back to my talk, there's a connection to the internet, there's a core services, and there's a RAN portion of it. That connection to the internet relies on a solid fiber infrastructure. So that can make those connections reach out to rural communities, and then to distribute. Now, when we look at what's happening there, the core network is going to be a commodity. It's not going to be super expensive, because you can roll them out really quickly. And as a result, because if we are going with an open RAN approach, which I'm sure that Microsoft and Rakuten and all of the new cloud providers are going to be forcing from the market side, there will be an open RAN, and there will be relatively cheap base stations that are able to come out. And as a result of all of the openness that's happening in the open RAN and the core development side, I see that for rural communities, this is going to present a really good opportunity for connectivity, for fixed wireless, for small community providers of internet. So not necessarily relying on an overall mobile internet. Possibly they can. I'm not seeing that well into the future, but possibly a 5G core can help a regional player in a community do that. But that's spectrum regulation and all of that. But overall, I think we need to keep in mind that when we're talking about 5G and building out infrastructure, there's infrastructure, and there's where the economic growth is on the services that sit on the 5G infrastructure. And so if businesses, and if we're a little bit behind on the infrastructure side, like building out the RAN and stuff. However, to build out services, I think this is where we can lead still today.
Great point to end on. Thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us. We're out of time here. Our next webinar is next Monday on June 22nd. We'll be hearing from a panel of small business owners on business resilience during COVID-19. And this follows the launch of our latest brief, Small Business Big Impact, How SMEs Are Pivoting During COVID-19. And then we have another one on Friday, June 26th from 12 to 1 with a conversation between Ken Hardwick, President and CEO of Ontario Power Generation, and Rocco Rossi on the completion of the Darlington refurbishment. I would really want to thank all our speakers for sharing their insights and expertise with us today. I feel like we could have had 3 hours on this topic. And thank you again to our partners, Hydro One, Waste Connections of Canada, Bruce Power, Canada Life, and Chambers Plan. And thank you to those at home for joining us. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.